We are Rogue Media Sports.
There are any number of reasons you might consider selling your home. To move closer to family, live within a smaller budget, or just wanting a change of scenery. Whatever your reasons, having to figure out all the various housing market trends in your area may not be what you signed up for. That's where an agent who is a realtor comes in. Realtors have the expertise to help you find the right price and navigate the process to sell your home in a way that's right for you. That's who we are. Realtors are members of the National Association of Realtors.
You haven't heard about the McCrispy yet? Well, then, you probably haven't heard the sweet silence after the first crispy bite either. Go try it for yourself to hear the best nut sound you've ever heard.
It is Matt Mosley alongside Ed Werder. Actually, Ed is at the Star as we speak. He is in the shadows of the Star out there with all the breaking news that has happened. Ed was the first to basically have it for ESPN that Jason Garrett was out. They finally kind of made it official yesterday afternoon. And then, Ed, the word goes out this morning that Mike McCarthy is the head coach of the Cowboys. Ed, from a timing standpoint, first of all, they had, while Jason was not quite officially out, although obviously they'd given every indication that they were moving on because they were already interviewing people. Marvin Lewis was in the mix, and then Mike McCarthy. The Cowboys go ahead and get that thing done, and then we hear more that Mike McCarthy stayed over at the Jones home, and then so I guess Sunday had breakfast over there, and Gene probably put some good things together. Ed, any surprise from you how quickly this thing unfolded and with Mike McCarthy?
Well, it's interesting to me that it took them a full week to officially announce that Jason Garrett would not return as the Cowboys head coach, and it took them less than a day after that to officially replace him with Mike McCarthy. And obviously McCarthy has contributed greatly to Jason Garrett's demise here because he twice ended recent Cowboys seasons in the playoffs by beating them, even though you could argue he had the inferior team with the Packers. But, I think one surprise to the fan base will be how precise in terms they were in targeting who they were interested in. They created the illusion that many believe that they were going to pursue some of these high-profile, expensive college coaches, given that, that's sort of where the NFL game is going now. It's more being influenced by college football than is the NFL influencing the way the game's played at the college level. And so I think there's a little bit of a surprise. But, if you have a team full of veterans that you think are ready to win and have just been poorly coached and motivated and therefore underachieved, then making a move in this direction with a proven NFL head coach, I think, makes a lot of sense. He's going to be the 9th head coach in Cowboys history. He's held up the Lombardi Trophy in the very stadium that Jerry Jones built, although history suggests that's a negative because 6 NFL head coaches have had 2 franchises in Super Bowls, but nobody in NFL history has won a Super Bowl with 2 different teams as surely the Jones family expects McCarthy to do. But, just talking to people here, I think they felt like I asked somebody, what do you have to get out of this next head coach that was lacking under Garrett? And the list provided me by sources was 3 things: fear, accountability, and discipline. Now, Mike McCarthy had all of those things early in his career when he was winning with the Packers. Those sort of things disappeared in his final 2 or 3 seasons, leading to him being fired during the season.
Ed Werder has been at some of these Super Bowls, is embedded with some of these teams, and so obviously you've come across Mike McCarthy over your years. Mike McCarthy, kind of interestingly, Ed, holed up with the NFL Network recently and then also with our friend Peter King, and talked of, kind of some things he did while his one season out of football to stay prepared and to be even better prepared for his next opportunity. He had a head coaching interview, I believe, with the Jets, had some other interests that he decided not to pursue, and then he sort of had a club that he was there in Green Bay that he put together and tried to almost keep a staff together while he was out. Ed, from that report and what he said he would put an analytics group together, from what you've been able to gather, what do you feel like Mike McCarthy felt like he needed to change, or what has he changed about his approach that we might find a little different from his long and successful run with the Green Bay Packers?
Yeah, he did in his season away from football. After being fired by the Packers and not being hired by the Jets, a job he lost to Adam Gase, he did get together and hire essentially a 6-person coaching staff that met regularly with him in Green Bay. And the attempt was to sort of modernize his offensive and defensive philosophies, to prepare game plans and playbooks and, sort of a coaching guide as to what they were going to do when they got another opportunity. An emotional and familial standpoint, he said his family really needed football again, that it was something that was a centerpiece of their existence as a family, and it was something that they desperately needed to get back to. And this is going to be interesting because, it's going to represent a change in offensive philosophy for the Cowboys in that, he's going to bring in the West Coast offensive concepts. While the Cowboys had adopted some of that in their playbook this last year with Kellen Moore calling the plays, the terminology is going to be significantly different. But I did talk to Brett Favre about this marriage between the Cowboys and Dak Prescott and Mike McCarthy, who, he played for much of his career. And he thought it was an ideal situation that McCarthy would create a great platform in his offense for Dak Prescott to have success, that he would be brash, he would be creative, he would be confident, he would be believable, all of those important qualities in inheriting a pretty experienced football team, at least on the offensive side of the ball. I think there'll be even bigger changes on the defensive side under Mike Nolan that we can get into later. But this is a guy who comes with a lot of credibility, but I think the biggest question would be, why did Mike McCarthy, for 13 years in Green Bay, have Brett Favre and Aaron Rodgers as his quarterbacks and only win one Super Bowl, the one that he won in North Texas, Super Bowl 45? And I think if you look at the end of his career, the last 3 years, he was not terribly successful then, and there was a lot of criticism that his offensive approach and his play calling lacked imagination and creativity, and that he basically went to 3 wide receiver sets with a single back and then let Aaron Rodgers just be Aaron Rodgers in an attempt to win the game. Now, I covered a lot of Packer games. I like Mike McCarthy. He's a really engaging guy. He's a serious guy. He's a regular guy. People would love him. But the one thing that I always took away was he didn't seem to be as committed to executing the running game on game day with his play calling as he would profess to be in talking to the media before the game. Until he obviously had a great runner in Aaron Jones, who was greatly underutilized by him and his coaching staff last year, because this year he set Packer records under Matt LaFleur, the first-year coach in Green Bay, who's won the division and advanced to the divisional round of the playoffs. But Mike McCarthy didn't have a 1,000-yard rusher since Eddie Lacy in 2014. So if you've committed, your organization to running the football and you're making Ezekiel Elliott the highest-paid running back in football, I think Mike's going to have to figure out a way to make sure that the running game is a big part of what he does on a regular basis. He didn't do that in Green Bay.
Ed, as I hear, and boy, you've had great information on ESPN. You've been on TV all day and really have enjoyed all that. But this is, from a visceral standpoint, how do fans react to this? This is not the most exciting name. This is a retread. That said, I think Kansas City has had tremendous success with what you'd call a retread head coach. Andy Reid had really grown stale. He'd had great success for years with the Eagles, but I think his time had truly come to an end. And we're going to see now, similar to Andy Reid's age when he got to Kansas City, is this coach who's sitting there at 56 years old, wanted one more shot at this, and now gets it. And in a sense, that's what they did with Wade Phillips. He was at a similar age, maybe a little bit older when he took over the Cowboys job. But it's people that have done it, have been productive. Ed, one thing I'll bring up, you know the Saints organization as well as anybody. What's funny isn't it interesting how in our minds some coaches are more exciting than others? I mean, if we took his record and put it next to Sean Payton's, it won't be too dissimilar. In fact,
Right.
125, 77, and 2, I think is the name that stands out in my, is the number that stands out in my mind right now. And he and Sean both have the Super Bowl, but isn't it interesting? We still think of Sean as sort of that genius quarterback guru kind of guy, and we don't necessarily have those same feelings toward Mike McCarthy. But obviously the results, in a sense, but both of them had great quarterbacks. Peyton's been connected to Drew Brees, the entire time, and as you mentioned, McCarthy's had Rodgers and Brett Favre. But we give Sean Payton more credit. People get more excited about him, and I just wonder how you react to that.
Well, I think that if Jerry Jones could hire anybody in football, maybe even before he'd hire Bill Belichick, he would hire Sean Payton.
Yeah.
I think he regards Sean Payton as the single most talented person to ever be allowed to leave the organization. But what you said about McCarthy and Payton is true. I mean, this is the third time that Jerry's hired a head coach with previous NFL experience, Bill Parcells, and as you mentioned, Wade Phillips. McCarthy's an accomplished guy. He won 10 or more games in 8 different seasons in his 13 years in Green Bay. He's won 10 playoff games, which is the most by a Packers coach in franchise history, and only exceeded by Bill Belichick since McCarthy became a head coach. And if you want consistency, I mean, he's led a single franchise to 8 consecutive playoff appearances. You know who's done that? Tom Landry, Chuck Noll, Bill Belichick, Mike McCarthy. So he's a very accomplished guy. I think he lost his passion and his interest to a certain degree, late in Green Bay. And, maybe this year away will energize him, and he'll bring that to an organization that I think needs that. I think they got tired of the Jason Garrett approach, the Jason Garrett message, everything's fine, don't worry about anything, we're going to win, no matter what anybody else says. We're not the problem's outside the building, just don't listen to all that. I don't think that'll be McCarthy. It's obviously going to be a huge transition for him in terms of you go from this tiny, the smallest professional sports town in America, in Green Bay, where it's a publicly owned franchise. Mark Murphy and the former general manager that he worked under, Ted Thompson, are very reclusive. They're not at all public. They don't speak almost ever. And McCarthy was often not allowed to make roster moves and personnel decisions, but he always had to account for them publicly. And I think he grew frustrated with that role. And certainly that won't be the situation here in Dallas, where I presume he wouldn't even have asked Jerry Jones to lower his public profile so as not to undermine his performance and authority as the head coach. It'll be interesting to see how all those things were addressed specifically as they went through contract points. But I would assume that McCarthy is going to embrace the idea more than most coaches would, that Jerry Jones is going to stand outside the locker room and he's going to update injuries. He's going to give his public opinion of game strategy and coaching decisions and the performance of players, just like he's always done. But to some degree, that might be a relief for Mike McCarthy. I don't think he craves the spotlight in that sort of way.
Can you, and it is the Doomsday Podcast, Ed Werder, Matt Mosley, an emergency podcast, a special edition as the Cowboys hire Mike McCarthy. Ed, with your mastery of the NFL and your longtime contacts with a lot of these people, take us back a couple of years to when McCarthy was fired. You said maybe he lost a little bit of that passion the last 3 years. I would say part of that is Aaron Rodgers is a difficult, prickly personality. I don't think you would dispute me on that one. And he is not an easy person to be around, but for a while they made it work, and they certainly had a ton of success together. From what you've been able to gather and what you remember about it, why did that relationship sour? Or was it just they just about had enough of each other and it was sort of a natural thing?
Yeah, I think it digressed over time. Obviously, McCarthy deserves a lot of credit for his role in overseeing the Packers through one of the most challenging quarterback transitions in history. Brett Favre's forced retirement, attempt to return, and his affection for and support of Aaron Rodgers as the Packers starting quarterback, resisting the will of Brett Favre and all that meant in Green Bay, and that carried a ton of weight. And for him to align himself with Aaron Rodgers because he thought it was time for the Packers to move on at quarterback, that says a lot about the conviction he had in Aaron Rodgers earlier than almost anybody else, quite honestly. And so I think Aaron appreciated that for a time, but the intensity of being close together, as long as they were with, there were some times that Rodgers had quarterbacks coaches like Tom Clemens, that he really liked, and not unlike the John Elway, Dan Reeves, Mike Shanahan dynamic. McCarthy began to think that Rodgers was too close to his position coach, and it was detrimental to his relationship with his starting quarterback, and so he would either diminish that person's role or fire that person. So that he had a more direct connection to Rodgers, and Rodgers would be upset about the move, didn't feel like it was justified, felt like it was done not to his benefit, and he didn't approve it. And so just all of those things, I think, over time affected the relationship in a negative way. I have a hard time seeing Dak Prescott that way. In fact, when I talk to people out here today about how is he going to deal with the transition that's going to be asked of him, I think we all know he's a pretty smart, dedicated football guy, and that's what he's all about. And he likes to be coached. He likes to be coached hard. He likes to be challenged. So I don't think there's going to be a problem anytime soon, if ever, between Mike McCarthy and Dak Prescott as a quarterback. And I think it'll be interesting to see as we go forward these next few days, which offensive coaches remain here. There are a number of them that are under contract that we understand, Jerry has requested be considered for positions, and I would include Kellen Moore and Mark Colombo and John Kitna on that list. And so some of that may help ease the transition in the system as well. And Kitna's got experience having played in the West Coast offense, and I know that McCarthy has said that he has a favorable impression of Kellen Moore, at least as a player. And I would think that Jerry thinks after 1 year of calling plays that, maybe it's good for Kellen to sit behind somebody for a year or two and learn from, Mike McCarthy in a different style of offense, that ultimately it'll benefit him. But I wouldn't expect there to be tension between Dak and Mike McCarthy, at least not very early on in this relationship, just knowing the kind of person Dak is, and given that, I don't think Mike is a real hard guy to play for. So I wouldn't anticipate a problem in their partnership.
Yeah, this is in a lot of ways this move makes so much sense. Ed, along the way, you had mentioned Zimmer. Zimmer wins that game the other day. They weren't supposed to win. In fact, they were more than touchdown underdogs, and that really sort of took Zimmer pretty much. He was already out of the equation because they were talking like they might bring him back. Now they are, and so there was really no way to do that. I think this was the bird in the hand. They talked to Mike McCarthy. They liked him. It's a extremely, I would say, Ed, when you talk about like in the draft, sometimes we talk about safe choices. This guy seems like a very safe choice. I don't know if he has like the highest ceiling as some of these other coaches might have, but we sort of know what his floor is. And we know, you just don't worry about it. It's not like you're going to get embarrassed by throwing Mike McCarthy out as your head coach. And quite honestly, with all due respect to Garrett, and I personally, I think both of us like some things about Garrett, but his his messaging and everything about Garrett, it was time for a change, and they needed to make a change. Now, Ed, Mike Nolan, news breaks this afternoon that he will be the defensive coordinator. Obviously, he comes from football royalty in the NFL, has coached about everywhere, but he was the head coach of the 49ers for about 3 seasons, as I recall it. That's where he and Mike McCarthy crossed paths. Mike McCarthy was his offensive coordinator before becoming the head coach of the Green Bay Packers. Now, you've watched, and of course Nolan has ties to Denver, and you have all sorts of ties to that organization as well. What light can you kind of shed on how different the defense might look, or how similar it might be with under Mike Nolan?
Yeah, Mike Nolan has some interesting ties to the Cowboys organization through his father, Dick Nolan, who was a longtime member of Tom Landry's staff and even coached when Jimmy Johnson took over back in 1989 for the franchise. So he has that sort of history. But, most recently he's been the linebackers coach with the New Orleans Saints. I think he's done a lot in terms of contributing to the overall performance of Dennis Allen's defense in New Orleans. And, the Cowboys are well familiar with how challenging that defense is. When they played them each of the last 2 years, they scored 10 points in one game and 13 points in the other game. So they know how challenging that defense is. And Nolan really did it at a position where I think you could argue the Saints committed, very few resources. I think they spent a lot more draft resources on their defensive line and in signing, Cameron Jordan at defensive end. Marcus Davenport, they gave up a first-round pick to move up and get him a year early. On the back end of their defense, Marshawn Lattimore was a first-round draft pick. They signed Janoris Jenkins. They traded for Eli Apple. So I think they made big investments either through trades or drafts in every position except at linebacker. Now, Demario Davis was obviously a big acquisition, but he believes in an aggressive attacking style of defense. He's used both the 3-4 and the 4-3. I would assume he's going to remain committed to the 4-3 here. And I just think the defensive part of it is huge to me. Like, it might even be bigger than the Mike McCarthy hire, because the defense to me and the special teams is what really let this team down last year and didn't allow them to achieve their internal objectives and expectations. And I mean, if you look over the last 4 years, since Dak Prescott became the quarterback and Ezekiel Elliott was drafted to be the running back, they're 31st in the NFL in interceptions, 35 interceptions in 4 seasons, and 27th in pressure percentage. So to me, those are the two things that Mike Nolan's got to create more of if they're going to, go deep in the playoffs and to championship games and Super Bowls. But, I don't really think we should underestimate Mike McCarthy, because he might not be a big name or a big personality, but the guy can coach, and he's won a Super Bowl, and he's been in the playoffs on a very consistent basis in a division that's been very challenging in recent years. So, it's a safe hire, but I think the Cowboys were in a position where they needed to make a safe hire.
Yeah.
They already wasted an entire decade. Jason Garrett, I find this unbelievable. Jason Garrett coached all but 8 games in the decade that began in 2010. Mm-hmm. And it ended with Jason Garrett having presided over the worst decade in franchise history as far as measuring it on the basis of playoff berths, only 3 in the entire decade. The Cowboys have never had fewer playoff appearances in an entire decade than they did under Jason Garrett. So it was clearly time for a change. Mike McCarthy had, 13 years in Green Bay. He's a very experienced guy. You're not going to surprise him with very much. He'll be well prepared. I think his message will be on point with the Cowboys going forward. And so I think this makes a lot more sense than going out and hiring a college guy.
Did you like the Cowboys release? What they said in it about that he did put the Cowboys in position, at least, I forget how many times, where they were playing in the last game of the season. And, obviously he failed several times doing that, but they kind of used that as a positive to remind people, boy, they were in the mix a lot of the time. But I did also find it funny that one of the guys being interviewed, and I know Marvin Lewis very respected in NFL circles, but that was about the only person you could find with less of a playoff record than Gary. And he had at least gotten there a ton of times. I mean, if you think about it, you've got to.
I think he's 0 for 7.
Yes, you got to get there a bunch. He's just never won, but that was like the first guy they interviewed. But they get McCarthy. It feels extremely safe. You're right. They with the talent where it is, they need to get it there, and they need this quarterback to align with McCarthy. They think he'll be good with him, and I think of all there were more exciting folks. I know Matt Rule's supposed to talk to the Panthers. He's my Baylor coach, my alma mater, and then he's supposed to talk to the New York Giants. Does he have a chance to put in some sort of system that could be great over the years? Maybe. But that wasn't going to happen with the Cowboys. You think Jerry's going to let him, oh, yeah, here, Matt Rule, let me just hand it over to you. And you just put your system in, and I'm going to go stand over here. That was not going to happen. And I thought the point you made is a good one. This is a personality. While he might not blow you away, he is pliable. He is someone who can work with Jerry, and that was a really interesting point you said. He might even be someone a little relieved at times not to have to shoulder the entire blame. I will say this, and you kind of hinted at this point. You may have tweeted this earlier. Ted Thompson was known, and again, he had success with the Packers. It's not like the guy didn't have success in the draft, and then, of course, Ron Wolf before him with the Packers. But I've met Ted and talked with him. He's a strange guy. He's all very accomplished. He played for Bum Phillips, I believe, with the Oilers back in the day.
Yeah,
he doesn't look like a guy who played. He just kind of comes across as a kind of a strange individual, or he did. But he just didn't. They almost lauded him or praised him for not doing anything in free agency. Oh, look, the Packers are standing pat. And as the point you made was, at some point, McCarthy, as the coach, is like, we might need to do something. There are parts of this team we could use help with, and that really wasn't their MO.
Well, but now it is. Now they have a new general manager and a new head coach. They promoted from within to replace Ted Thompson, and they were very active in free agency. In fact, you could argue that nobody did a better job in free agency than the Packers, especially getting Zadarius Smith and Preston Smith for their defensive front and, creating real pressure that they didn't have. I mean, we all saw what happened to Dallas when they lost by 10 to the Packers this year. And it's worth noting that Matt LaFleur, first-year head coach, he's the only first-year head coach among the 8 in the league this year who had a winning record, won his division, and went to the playoffs. And part of that success was he inherited Aaron Rodgers. Nobody else did that. And he had the good fortune of a general manager who was aggressive in free agency and who made very wise investments and has created a defense that's far more competitive than it was in previous years. I guarantee you Mike McCarthy was sitting up there in Green Bay as they were going 13-3 without him, wondering, well, how come this expenditure was I never had the luxury of this opportunity, How come I always had one of the youngest rosters in football because we lost guys, we couldn't sign anybody, and Ted Thompson wanted to play all his draft picks early on. And so they were often in a position where they would get off to slow starts because they're playing young guys who really weren't ready to be part of a winning equation on a consistent basis. And that put a lot of pressure on the head coach, and it put even more pressure on the quarterback. Yeah,
it did. And we remember Aaron Rodgers about 4 or 5 years ago famously said after one of those slow starts, relax. And everybody kind of looked at that quote and said, okay, and he did kind of get it together, and they rallied that season. But we give so much credit. It is kind of funny how with Breeze, we give Breeze, we sort of think they're almost equals. I keep coming back to that, Ed. It's like Peyton and Breeze, they can't do it without each other. But with Rodgers, sometimes he gets credit for sort of doing it on his own. And McCarthy was there with him that whole time. And so you're right, they had a lot of productive years. Ed, anything on the offensive side of the ball? We're wondering, okay, Kellen Moore, John Kitna, all of that. West Coast, when we kind of look at that and how that's going to be implemented in a team where the DNA for years was to the old Zampese tree, the longer routes. We know Linehan came from that school of thought. Obviously, Kellen Moore came up under Linehan. How different should we expect this offense to look? And is it fair to try to think about, okay, exactly how Green Bay, and boy, good point, by the way, on the running game, because for years they just sort of got by with really not much at running. In fact, Eddie Lacy almost ate himself out of the league, may have ended up doing that, and they got some production out of him for a time. But you're right. One of the reasons there was so much pressure on Aaron Rodgers was because he did not have a running game year after year after year.
And I don't know if it's that they didn't feel like they could win that way, or more likely to me, I think Mike got captivated and Aaron had enough control of the offense that it became, hey, let's just let Aaron Rodgers, be Aaron Rodgers, and let's have some playground football here. And I know, it was interesting because to talk to Matt LaFleur this year before the Cowboys played the Packers, and that was one of the things he mentioned was, I'm a guy who likes to run the football, and he did that at Tennessee with Derrick Henry, obviously, and he wanted to bring that to Green Bay, and he has with Aaron Jones. But as they were making the transition, he said, you really have to make a point of it because it's so easy to just say, wow, Aaron Rodgers we can just throw it every play. Like, why would we not want to do that? The guy is so, incredible with the football in his hands, whether he's in the pocket, out of the pocket, under the center, in the shotgun. It's just really easy for a coach to give into that and let Rodgers do what he wants to do and dominate with the passing game. And it really, creates a problem for your defense that's on the field too much, and the Cowboys have had that experience. But I think what you'll see is a lot more short passes, a lot more emphasis on run after the catch, a lot more of the running backs involved in the passing game, which is good for a guy like Tony Pollard. And Ezekiel Elliott, quite frankly, had 77 catches, the most in franchise history for a running back. I think they like to have a tight end that can control the middle of the field. So Jarwin would certainly seemingly be a pretty good fit in this offensive scheme. But that's a big part of what has to happen is Mike has got to be aware of the need to run the football, and that's something that just cannot be ignored given the commitment that the Cowboys have made. If you want to know, how effective this offense still is, I mean, this is the Mike Shanahan, offense essentially.
Yeah.
And so it's what Kyle Shanahan's running with the 49ers. They were among the best running teams in football. It's what the Rams are using, and obviously Todd Gurley 2 years ago was one of the best running backs in football. And so I think Zeke can fit, but Mike McCarthy has to keep that in mind on a weekly basis as he calls plays in games.
I think he will, and this is going to be interesting. Ed, you've been great on this. Appreciate all your TV work. Appreciate you being part of this special edition as we get ready for the Mike McCarthy era. Still trying to get used to this. It's funny what you said about him hawing around about Jason. I mean, there were reports that Jason was still lobbying for his job, which, boy, sounds strange that you wouldn't be able to read the tea leaves, but it just says a lot, too, about this organization. And at some point, they had to bull on and say, hey, we got to go interview some people. And I think some of these other names you brought up, Ed, were probably in the mix. I'm talking about Zimmer, Kubiak, some of these others were always at least in the mix. But when they got a guy that they felt like was a great fit and had the head coaching experience, they decided, let's get this thing done, and let's not get in a deal where we're out here waiting on assistant coaches. And quite honestly, Jerry is just even a guy like Stefanski, who people are excited about right now because of some of the things he's done and what he's been able to do with Dalvin Cook and others in Minnesota. Jerry, that's not him. I mean, the only kind of assistant he was ever going to hire is his own homegrown guy like Jason Witten. The thought of him going after even Josh McDaniels, who you're a big proponent of, that never sat right with Jerry because he craved that head coaching experience.
Well, and with Josh McDaniels, he's obviously operated in the Patriots, organization. For a head coach who's in total control of every facet of the football organization. And, that's not something that Jerry's going to embrace, that kind of concept. So I think the other point, and you mentioned Minnesota. Minnesota's a team that runs the Shanahan style of offense, the West Coast offense. That's why they brought Gary Kubiak in, because he runs that system. And you look at what they've done with Dalvin Cook as a runner and a receiver. Like, the Cowboys have the ability to do that, in my opinion, as well. And to your point about being strategic, and once you felt comfortable with McCarthy, immediately following through and making sure that he doesn't go anywhere else. I think the timing of this was crucial in this way. I think the Cowboys were motivated to act decisively once they had a favorable meeting with McCarthy, because they knew he was a candidate with three other teams where he had already interviewed: the Giants, the Browns, and the Panthers. And none of those three teams were able to do what the Cowboys did, because they were still waiting to pursue Josh McDaniels. He's interviewing them all this week. So the Cowboys were able to maximize their leverage by being the first to commit to McCarthy, to say, hey, you may be it appears you're the backup guy with those three franchises. This is the biggest job in football, and we are offering it to you before anybody else. You don't need to sit around and wait and see where Josh McDaniels goes, knowing you're the second choice of whoever offers you a job after that. We've got a team ready to win. We play in the big room in Vegas, as Bill Parcells once compared it to being Frank Sinatra playing the main showroom. And so I think they made a compelling case to Mike McCarthy, and the timing for them was exquisite.
And to get to stay at Jerry's house, that was the end of it. And I think I compare this to you, Ed. You had some time off to kind of think about things and put your analytics crew together and really spend some time thinking. That's what McCarthy did. And when he did...
Yeah, and I want to make a point about that if I can. I talked to one of Mike McCarthy's agents early on in this process, Trace Armstrong, and one of the points he made when I asked him about this perception, that Mike's kind of a curmudgeonly, guy who's kind of stuck in a traditional football mindset. He said that Mike actually created the first analytics department with the Packers. The problem was all of the funding for hirings and for any kind of technology that needed to be purchased had to go through Ted Thompson, and he just was not a big proponent of that because he was a former scout, so he believed in a scout's intuition over any kind of analytical analysis and data.
They couldn't get it approved. They couldn't get the computers. I like that. I hope Jerry will approve some. He famously asked Dan Reeves. He lost him over asking him to clock in, and Dan Reeves said no. But I do think Jerry is open to analytics, so we will see. Ed, great stuff. Appreciate all your work at the Star, and I'm leaving the plush Frito Nation Productions. I may just drive out there and bring you something. You just tell me what you need to eat, and you've been hard at it. And if I can bring you something, you just let me know, okay?
Well, I appreciate that. The Cowboys, it's a great place to work when you're covering the team during the season at the Star.
Yeah.
The problem is the second the season ends, they lock up the building and don't allow us access anymore. So we're out in the plaza, which, as you know, is got a big, giant, artificial field, and there's a million kids out here throwing footballs around, and the big screens playing. And the good thing is there are plenty of restaurants, and the people at the Omni Hotel have been very tolerant of me spending $3 on a cup of coffee so that I can loiter in the hotel the rest of the day. So we certainly appreciate that.
Yeah.
I'm well taken care of at the moment.
By the way, Concrete Cowboy, I will say this. In just a moment, I called them to see if we could do something over there, and they said, if you need us, leave a text. And I thought, that's the strangest thing. But I just went ahead and tried it, Ed. Within 3 minutes, they had responded and said, anything you and Ed need. So let's keep them in mind in the future. They were, some of those others, which I won't mention, were a little difficult to work with. Concrete Cowboy literally just responded to like a blind text and said, guys, we'll put you a studio on our patio across from. So Ed, keep that in mind when you're out there. The concrete, okay. The only thing it might do is they play loud music over there. I feel like that could interrupt some of your reports. But I thought
I actually spent a very pleasant evening just before the season opener up there with Rocky Arsenault and some of his associates as they had flown in and were trying to resolve the Ezekiel Elliott contract dispute,
okay.
Which they did that very night or in the overnight hours, and got Zeke in, so that Jason Garrett could make a big run with all his personnel to try and keep his job.
Yeah, well, I wanted to say something nice about him because they were very willing to meet all our needs. Thanks, Ed. We really appreciate it.
We have a lot of needs. we have a lot of needs. Let's be honest.
We certainly do, and we appreciate you, Ed, and everything that you do. Ed is live from the Star. Okay, Ed, go get on TV. There he goes. He's going to go jump on TV now. There he goes. Ed Werder, live from the Star. I am in the Frito Nation Productions. So much breaking news today, and want to say thank you on the special episode. Hudson Financial Group, HFG. Ventures.net is how you find them, HFGventures.net. And appreciate Randy Hudson for all he's done this year. That's property casualty insurance. You can get all your life insurance needs met with them. And then once you do that, they bring you in and start taking care of all your needs and your financial estate planning, all the many things that you need to do. And you can find a lot of information, HFG Ventures. That stands for Hudson Financial Group. And we appreciate them. And also, of course, the Hodges Capital. Saw Craig Hodges while I was doing radio in New Orleans for the Baylor Sugar Bowl. Craig Hodges and his brother. That's Hodges Capital. They are a huge part of what we do. And Craig and Clark Hodges, just great friends of ours and great friends of the Doomsday Podcast. Mark Friedman, a man who's... boy, I tell you, he's had a lot going on. He's had an illness recently, but he fights through it all, and he's laughing, but he didn't really feel like I needed to share his illness. But Frito Nation Productions, a beautiful place to get some work done, and if you ever need to do a podcast, I would recommend reaching out to Mark Friedman. It is Matt Mosley. The new coach of the Dallas Cowboys is Mike McCarthy. Who would have thought it, but he is now the head coach of the Cowboys. We'll see how this goes moving forward. We'll have a news conference later this week, but of course, this was the special edition Doomsday Podcast. Good night, everybody.
Have been hung. You're praying for your daughter, lighting candles for your son.
It's one thing falling in love with a house, picturing yourself moving in and calling it home, and quite another navigating the world of price negotiating, mortgage lenders, and finding the budget that works best for you. An agent who's a Realtor can make understanding that world easier. Realtors have the expertise, access to proprietary data, and tools to help you get from imagining living somewhere to actually doing it. That's the kind of help we can provide. Because that's who we are. Realtors are members of the National Association of Realtors.
You haven't heard about the McCrispy yet? Well, then, you probably haven't heard the sweet silence after the first crispy bite either. Go try it for yourself to hear the best nut sound you've ever heard.